On a frigid December morning in 1887, the most powerful man in Pittsburgh made a discovery that would haunt him for the rest of his days. When steel magnate Cornelius Vandemark descended the marble staircase of his Fifth Avenue mansion, he found his wife's emerald evening gown laid out perfectly on the Persian rug of their grand foyer, still warm to the touch, as if she had just stepped out of it moments before. But Evangeline Vandemark was nowhere to be found. The front door remained locked from the inside, every window sealed against the bitter Pennsylvania winter, and not a single servant had seen or heard anything unusual during the night. What made this disappearance even more chilling was that Evangeline had been seen by 3 different household staff members going to bed just 4 hours earlier, wearing that very same gown. The Pittsburgh Police Department, pressured by Vandemark's political connections, officially closed the case after only 6 days, citing insufficient evidence of foul play. But the truth about what happened to Evangeline Vandemark that December night was far more sinister than anyone could have imagined, involving a web of industrial espionage, family secrets, and a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of Pittsburgh's Gilded society. What investigators never discovered was that Evangeline's disappearance was merely the final act in a drama that had been unfolding for over 2 years. A deadly game of cat and mouse between a woman seeking justice for her murdered father and a husband whose empire was built on the bones of his enemies. Before we continue with the story of Evangeline Vandemark and uncover the dark truth behind her disappearance, I want to ask you to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss stories like this. Also, let me know in the comments which state or city you're listening from. I love connecting with our audience from all across America. Now let me take you back to the winter of 1887, when Pittsburgh's steel barons ruled like kings and murder was just another business expense. The winter of 1887 found Pittsburgh at the height of its industrial glory, a city where fortunes were made in steel and coal, and where the smokestacks of countless factories painted the sky in perpetual shades of gray. The air itself seemed to carry the weight of ambition and desperation, thick with coal smoke and the dreams of thousands of immigrants who had come to America seeking their fortune in the blazing furnaces of Pennsylvania's mills. It was a city of stark contradictions, where magnificent mansions stood just blocks away from squalid tenements, and where a man could rise from poverty to unimaginable wealth, or fall from grace into an unmarked grave in a matter of months. The Vandemark mansion stood as a testament to this new American aristocracy, a 4-story Gothic revival masterpiece that dominated an entire city block on Fifth Avenue, its towers and turrets casting long shadows over the Allegheny River below. The building itself was a monument to excess, featuring hand-carved stone gargoyles imported from French quarries, stained glass windows depicting scenes from industrial triumph, and a grand ballroom that could accommodate 300 of Pittsburgh's elite. The mansion's grounds sprawled across 4 acres of meticulously maintained gardens, greenhouse conservatories, and outbuildings that included a carriage house large enough for a dozen vehicles, servants' quarters that housed the estate's substantial staff, and the mysterious ice house that would later play such a crucial role in the dark events to come. Cornelius Vandemark had built his empire from nothing, starting as a common laborer in the steel mills before revolutionizing the production process with innovations that made him one of the wealthiest men in America. At 52, he was an imposing figure with steel-gray hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see through anyone who dared cross him in business. His hands, though now soft from years of prosperity, still bore the calluses and scars of his early days working the furnaces, a reminder of the brutal world he had clawed his way out of through a combination of brilliant engineering insight and utterly ruthless business practices. Those who knew him in his early days often remarked on the transformation from the idealistic young inventor who had genuinely believed his innovations could improve working conditions for all steel workers, to the cold industrial titan who would later orchestrate the deaths of anyone who threatened his empire. Cornelius's rise to power had not been achieved through innovation alone. In the cutthroat world of 1880s industrial America, success often required a willingness to employ methods that would make even the most hardened robber baron pause. Vandemark had learned early that competitors could be eliminated through means far more permanent than simple market competition. A strategic fire here, a boiler explosion there, the mysterious disappearance of a rival's key engineer. These were the tools of industrial warfare in an age where government oversight was minimal and law enforcement could be bought for the price of a politician's campaign fund. His marriage to Evangeline Hartwell in 1882 had been the social event of the decade. She, the daughter of a prominent Boston banking family, 20 years his junior, with auburn hair that caught the light like spun copper and a laugh that could fill an entire ballroom. At 25, Evangeline possessed the kind of refined beauty and sophisticated education that marked her as a member of New England's old money aristocracy. She spoke fluent French and German, played piano with near-professional skill, and had received the finest education available to women of her social class at Miss Porter's school in Connecticut. But beneath her polished exterior lay a sharp intelligence and moral compass that would ultimately put her on a collision course with her husband's criminal empire. The wedding had been a calculated move on Cornelius's part, designed to provide his industrial empire with the social legitimacy that only an alliance with Boston's banking elite could offer. The Hartwell family's connections opened doors throughout New England's financial community, allowing Vandemark to secure the massive loans necessary to expand his steel production and acquire smaller competitors. For her part, Evangeline had entered the marriage believing she was allying herself with a man whose innovations could genuinely improve the lives of American workers, unaware that her new husband viewed human life as just another resource to be exploited in pursuit of profit. But by the winter of 1887, those who knew the couple intimately whispered that all was not well in the Vandemark household. Evangeline, once the sparkling centerpiece of Pittsburgh's social scene, had grown increasingly withdrawn over the past year. She spent hours alone in the mansion's extensive library, writing in a leather-bound journal that she kept locked in her personal writing desk with a small brass key that she wore on a chain around her neck. The library itself was a magnificent room, with floor-to-ceiling shelves containing over 3,000 volumes, including first editions of literary classics, scientific treatises, and an extensive collection of books on American industrial history that Evangeline had been accumulating since her arrival in Pittsburgh. The household staff, a carefully selected group of 12 individuals who had served the family for years, noticed that she had begun taking long walks at odd hours, often returning with muddy boots and a distant look in her green eyes. These walks frequently took her through Pittsburgh's working-class neighborhoods, where she would speak with the wives and children of mill workers, learning firsthand about the dangerous conditions and frequent accidents that plagued the city's industrial workforce. What the servants didn't know was that these conversations were part of Evangeline's growing investigation into the suspicious patterns of industrial accidents that seemed to follow in her husband's wake, wherever his business interests led him. The Vandemark estate employed some of Pittsburgh's most trusted servants, each chosen not only for their skills, but for their discretion and absolute loyalty to the family. Margaret Sullivan, the Irish head housekeeper, had overseen the mansion's daily operations for nearly a decade after emigrating from County Cork during the devastating potato famine of the 1870s. She was a woman of fierce intelligence and unshakable moral principles, qualities that had made her invaluable to the Vandemark household, but would also make her a crucial witness to the strange events surrounding Evangeline's disappearance. Thomas Brennan, the gruff Scottish groundskeeper, had arrived in America with his wife and 3 children in 1868, fleeing the economic devastation that followed the Highland clearances. His family had worked for wealthy Americans since their arrival, and Thomas took immense pride in maintaining the Vandemark estate's grounds to perfection. But his keen eye for detail and intimate knowledge of every inch of the property would reveal disturbing signs that someone had been using the estate for purposes far darker than anyone imagined. Charles Henley served as the mansion's butler, a position that required him to be present for all of the family's social functions and privy to many of their private conversations. Originally from Philadelphia, Henley had been trained in the finest traditions of English domestic service and prided himself on maintaining the highest standards of professional discretion. But even his carefully cultivated neutrality would be tested by the increasingly bizarre and frightening events that surrounded Evangeline's final months in the mansion. Dr. Franklin Westbrook had served as the Vandemark family physician for over 5 years, making regular visits to the mansion to attend to both Cornelius and Evangeline's health needs. A graduate of Harvard Medical School and a respected member of Pittsburgh's professional community, Dr. Westbrook had begun to notice troubling changes in Evangeline's behavior and physical condition during the months leading up to her disappearance. His private medical notes, which would later be discovered by investigators, revealed his growing concern about what he euphemistically described as marital difficulties that seemed to be taking an increasingly severe toll on his patient's mental and physical well-being. These were people who prided themselves on discretion and loyalty, making Evangeline's disappearance all the more puzzling to those who knew the rigid hierarchy and watchful eyes that governed every aspect of life in the mansion. The Vandemark household operated with the precision of a fine timepiece, with every servant knowing their exact duties and schedule down to the minute. This rigid order made it virtually impossible for anyone to enter or leave the mansion unnoticed, a fact that would make Evangeline's mysterious disappearance seem all the more supernatural to those who didn't understand the darker forces at work behind the scenes. The city of Pittsburgh itself seemed to hold its breath during that bitter winter of 1887, as if sensing that the forces of change and violence that had shaped its rapid growth were about to claim another victim. The recent Haymarket riot in Chicago had sent shockwaves through America's industrial centers, and Pittsburgh's own labor movements were growing increasingly organized and militant in their demands for safer working conditions and fair wages. Into this volatile atmosphere came whispers of a secret organization of industrialists who had banded together to maintain their power through any means necessary, including the systematic elimination of anyone who threatened their control over America's growing industrial empire. The events of December 12, 1887, began like any other winter evening in the Vandemark household, with the precise routine that had governed daily life in the mansion for over 5 years. Margaret Sullivan would later testify to police that she had served dinner to Mr. and Mrs. Vandemark in the formal dining room at precisely 7 o'clock, as was their custom. The dining room itself was a masterpiece of Victorian excess, featuring a massive mahogany table that could seat 24 guests, illuminated by a crystal chandelier imported from Bohemia, and surrounded by oil paintings depicting scenes of industrial triumph that Cornelius had commissioned from prominent American artists. The meal that evening consisted of roasted pheasant, winter vegetables from the estate's greenhouse, and a bottle of French wine from Cornelius's private cellar, a 1878 Chateau Margaux that had cost more than most Pittsburgh workers earned in a month. Margaret noted that Evangeline seemed unusually quiet during the meal, barely touching her food and responding to her husband's conversation with only brief nods and murmurs. But what struck the housekeeper as most unusual was the way Evangeline kept glancing toward the dining room windows, as if expecting to see someone approaching through the snow-covered grounds. She had the look of a woman who knew something terrible was coming. Margaret would later tell Detective Samuel Crawford, her thick Irish accent heavy with emotion, like she was trying to memorize every detail of the room, as if she knew it might be the last time she'd see it. Cornelius, for his part, appeared to be in unusually high spirits that evening, speaking animatedly about a new steel contract he had secured with the Pennsylvania Railroad and his plans for expanding operations into Ohio and West Virginia. But Charles Henley, serving the meal with his characteristic silent efficiency, noticed that despite his cheerful demeanor, Cornelius kept checking his pocket watch throughout dinner, behavior that suggested he was expecting some predetermined event to occur at a specific time. At 9:30, Margaret had helped Evangeline prepare for bed, assisting her into the emerald silk evening gown that she often wore when entertaining at home, though no guests were expected that evening. This detail would later puzzle investigators, as Evangeline typically wore simpler nightclothes when retiring, and the elaborate evening gown seemed entirely inappropriate for a quiet night at home. The gown itself was a stunning creation, imported from Paris at a cost of nearly $500, with intricate beadwork that caught the light from the gas lamps and created an almost ethereal effect as Evangeline moved. Margaret specifically remembered complimenting the gown's intricate beadwork, and Evangeline had smiled, the first genuine expression of happiness the housekeeper had seen from her mistress in weeks. But along with that smile came something else that would haunt Margaret for the rest of her life. Evangeline had embraced her, holding her tightly for several long seconds while whispering, "Thank you for your kindness, Margaret. You've been like a mother to me these past years." At the time, Margaret had been touched by the unexpected display of affection, but looking back, she realized it had felt very much like a goodbye. She looked almost relieved, Margaret would later tell the police. Like a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders, if you understand my meaning. But there was something else there too, a kind of terrible sadness, as if she knew she was about to lose everything she held dear. During the preparation for bed, Margaret also noticed that Evangeline was wearing a piece of jewelry she had never seen before, a small silver locket on a thin chain around her neck. When Margaret commented on it, Evangeline had simply said it contained something precious that must be preserved, but she refused to open it or explain its significance. The locket was ornate in design, with intricate Celtic knotwork that suggested Irish craftsmanship, and it seemed strangely out of place among Evangeline's usual collection of expensive but understated jewelry. Thomas Brennan, making his final rounds of the estate's perimeter at 11 o'clock, reported seeing a light in Evangeline's private study on the second floor. Through the frost-covered window, he observed her silhouette seated at her writing desk, her pen moving steadily across paper in what appeared to be urgent, almost frantic writing. This was the last confirmed sighting of Evangeline Vandemark alive, though Thomas would later remember thinking at the time that something about her posture suggested desperation rather than the calm correspondence that usually occupied her evening hours. What Thomas couldn't see from his position on the grounds was the scene unfolding inside Evangeline's study. The room was her private sanctuary, decorated with mementos from her childhood in Boston and filled with the books and personal papers that represented her true intellectual interests. That night, Evangeline was engaged in what she knew would be her final act of documentation, writing a detailed account of everything she had discovered about her husband's criminal activities and the systematic murder campaign that had eliminated dozens of his competitors and potential threats. The study itself bore witness to months of careful investigation. Hidden behind seemingly innocent books were photographs, documents, and correspondence that revealed the true scope of the Pittsburgh Circle's activities. Maps of Pennsylvania and neighboring states were marked with red pins, indicating the locations of suspicious industrial accidents, each accompanied by detailed notes about the victims, the circumstances of their deaths, and the business advantages that had accrued to Circle members as a result. At 6 in the morning, when Margaret arrived to begin her daily duties, she discovered the front door locked from the inside, with the heavy iron bolt that could only be engaged from within the house securely in place. The mansion's 12 windows on the ground floor were all latched shut, their locks showing no signs of tampering. Margaret tested each one personally, as she had been trained to do during her years of service, and found them all secure with no indication that anyone had attempted to force them open from the outside. The second and third floor windows were too high to access without a ladder, and Thomas confirmed that all ladders remained in the carriage house, undisturbed and covered with a thin layer of snow that had fallen during the night. The snow itself told its own story, a perfect blanket of white that showed no footprints or other signs of disturbance around the mansion's perimeter. If someone had left the house during the night, they had done so without touching the ground. But it was the discovery in the foyer that stopped Margaret's heart and sent Charles Henley running to fetch Thomas from the grounds. There, Arranged with almost ceremonial precision on the imported Persian rug lay Evangeline's emerald gown. The fabric was still warm when Margaret touched it, as if Evangeline had only just removed it, and the scent of her signature lavender perfume hung in the cold morning air like the ghost of her presence. The gown appeared to have been removed with great care, lying flat and perfectly arranged as if it were being displayed for viewing. No buttons were torn, no seams were damaged, and the delicate beadwork remained intact. Beside the gown lay a single piece of paper, a page torn from Evangeline's private journal, with only 4 words written in her distinctive handwriting: "The truth must survive." But there were other, more disturbing details that the servants noticed in those first terrifying moments of discovery. The Persian rug beneath the gown showed slight discoloration, as if it had been recently cleaned or treated with some kind of chemical solution. The air in the foyer carried not just the scent of lavender perfume, but also a faint odor that Thomas later described as medicinal, like the stuff they use in hospitals to put people to sleep. Most puzzling of all was the condition of Evangeline's jewelry. Her wedding ring, a massive diamond surrounded by emeralds that was worth more than most people's homes, lay on the marble floor beside the gown. But the small silver locket that Margaret had noticed the night before was nowhere to be found. It was as if whoever had removed Evangeline's gown had specifically taken that one piece of jewelry while leaving behind items of